The Conservative conference closed today with an upbeat speech from an under-pressure leader looking to sieve back momentum from reform. Insisting that a government led by her could deliver an era of prosperity and security, Kemi Badenoch's big announcement was a plan to scrap stamp duty on main home purchases in England and Northern Ireland. Here's a flavour of what she had to say.
In the 1940s, our test was to defeat fascism and ensure the victory of freedom. In the 1980s, it was to banish socialism and deliver prosperity. And in the 2020s, our test is to restore a strong economy, secure our borders, and rebuild Britain's strength so our children inherit a country that works. We need to remember who we are fighting for. We are fighting for people who work hard and do the right thing. We are fighting for people who ask, why do sickness benefits pay more than the minimum wage? To fix our country, we must reverse Labour's measures. So, we will cancel their vindictive tax on education. Vicky knows what's coming. We will scrap their tax on family farms. Andrew, we will scrap their tax on family businesses. And we will reverse the terrible measures in Angela Rayner's unemployment bill, written by the unions for the unions. I have looked at the stamp duty thresholds to see where we can change them. I have looked at the rates you have to pay to see if we can lower them. I have decided that we can't, because that simply wouldn't be enough. Conference, the next Conservative government will abolish stamp duty on your home.
So where does her speech and the conference as a whole leave Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party? We got the thoughts of the Talk TV presenter Peter Cardwell, who is a special advisor to 4 Tory cabinet ministers, and the political commentator Katrina Stewart. Peter, so you've been at the conference over the last few days. What did you make of Kemi Badenoch's speech today?
I think it was probably the best speech I've seen her make. There was quite a lot at stake here, and I think she probably delivered. For a long time, people have been asking, what do the Conservatives actually stand for? And since Kemi Badenoch has been the leader for nearly a year now, the answer has been that a lot of people just don't know. They've talked about principles, they've talked about plans, but today there was quite a lot of meat on the bone. She also seemed pretty relaxed. She seemed to be laughing, enjoying herself, and actually some of the policies that she's talked about fairness in the welfare system, about abolishing stamp duty, that's the big headline one. Well, actually, I think those could cut through.
Yeah, I mean, she was having a great old time. She was laughing quite a lot, wasn't she, Peter? I mean, as you say, the Tories are having a real policy blitz this week.
Certainly, I mean, there's so many things they're talking about, whether it's inheritance tax with farms that they want to reverse. For example, private school fees, which is a big bugbear of people who pay VAT on them. That is something those people, the small number of people, but they really, really care about. And actually, it was really a real blitz of policy, I think, in the last few days that we just haven't seen in the last few months. Now, whether that can actually have an impact, whether that can pep up the 16% or so that the Conservatives are at in the polls, well, that's a very big ask, especially when Reform UK, their main rival, are more than twice as much in some polls anyway. But there were big attacks on Keir Starmer, certainly as well, and a little bit about Nigel Farage.
Yeah, I mean, Kat, we'll come back to reform, but do you agree with Peter that she did better than was expected?
She did far better than was expected. She seemed very relaxed. She managed to make some jokes that were genuinely funny and landed very well. Of course, this is all within the bubble. It remains to be seen how this will play with the wider electorate, but she is a woman who is to some extent fighting for her place as leader of the party. It's only a couple of weeks until the Conservatives could launch another leadership campaign.
Yeah.
But I think today she has set out her stall very clearly. She's performed very well. It might not be a pardon, but I think it was certainly a stay of execution.
Well, I mean, it did seem to go down very well in the hall itself, but, you know, you mentioned the public there. Do you think it will cut through?
She's definitely trying to appeal to traditional Conservative voters who might be wavering and moving over to reform. She's very much setting out her stall with regards to the economy. She is talking about reversing Labour policies. I think some of these will appeal to voters more broadly, but also it doesn't really matter that much at the moment, because where we are in the electoral cycle, it's a long time until she will actually have to appeal to voters. The more important thing is how this will play in Scotland, and will it help Russell Finlay at the upcoming Holyrood elections?
Yeah. I mean, Peter, Keir Starmer made a lot of references to reform and Nigel Farage in his conference speech. And as you say, Kemi Badenoch only mentioned them a couple of times. What can we read into that?
I think there were a lot of lessons that the Conservatives learned this week from last week in Liverpool with Labour. So many references on almost obsession with Reform UK at Labour in Liverpool. Well, that was avoided to a large degree in Manchester, at the Conservative conference. What I think is interesting as well, that the role of Robert Jenrick, fascinating at that conference as well. He really, there was a huge controversy, of course, over his comments on race, but in general at the conference, he was someone who really tried to keep the focus on Kemi Badenoch and not himself as much as possible. It's very interesting. He was recording a podcast. I was walking past, actually. He was recording a podcast, and there was an audience there, and the convener of the podcast said, well, let's talk about leadership. And Robert Jenrick simply said to the audience, I don't want to talk about leadership. Do you want to talk about leadership? The audience was on his side, and actually he kept the focus on Kemi Badenoch. So they've learned the lessons of Andy Burnham last week, and I think they've learned the lessons of not referring and being obsessed with Reform UK too much, despite their huge attempts to knock this off course with 20 defections of councillors yesterday.
Yeah, so you think that was very deliberate, Kat? Was the smart politics not to keep mentioning reform as Keir Starmer did?
Absolutely. For Keir Starmer, it's useful to set up reform as being his direct opposition rather than the Conservatives, because obviously it's beneficial to Labour to sideline the Conservatives. But Kemi Badenoch very deliberately kept mentions of Nigel Farage to the absolute minimum. She isn't talking about reform. The converse of that, though, is reform isn't talking about the Conservatives. And to some extent, they get a lot of publicity. When they talk about Labour, it generates headlines. So I think Margaret Thatcher coined the phrase oxygen of publicity. Mm-hmm. It might actually damage them to not be tackling reform head on.
Mm. So, Peter, has Kemi Badenoch done enough to silence her doubters?
I agree with Kat in that I think that there is certainly some sort of stay of execution. The real test, both for Kemi Badenoch and for Keir Starmer, will be actually the Scottish, Welsh elections and also the English local elections in May time. I think that's going to go really badly for both the main parties, particularly the Conservatives, and I think at that point there will be definite questions about the leadership of those two parties, particularly the Conservatives. For the meantime and for the rest of this year, it's hard to predict these things, but I would say Kemi Badenoch is safe. It's really interesting as well how people, often pundits like me, will say, oh, you know, Reform UK are so far ahead. Let's just remind ourselves where we were at this stage in the electoral cycle 5 years ago. People were saying that Boris Johnson was going to get a fifth term for the Conservatives. A lot can change very, very quickly, and Kemi Badenoch knows that too. And
who do you think would take over then, Peter?
I think it probably has to be Robert Jenrick, maybe James Cleverly, but the fact is there is no one person. When people talked about Boris Johnson coming back, there is no one person who can rescue the Conservatives from the doldrums they're in now. Maybe it'll happen in a few years' time, maybe it'll happen after Reform are in government. Who knows? But for the meantime, I think it's highly unlikely that Kemi Badenoch becomes Prime Minister at any point. The question is, can she be a very good leader of the opposition, hold Labour to account and do some of the groundwork that needs to be done to get the Conservatives back on track to some degree, especially in the face of reform? Yeah,
so there's going to be a lot riding on the Scottish elections. Russell Finlay today said he would back the idea of abolishing the stamp duty, which is devolved in Scotland, of course. But he's got an election next year. I mean, are his chances boosted at all by the conference this week?
I don't think the conference this week is going to have a huge amount of impact for the Scottish Tories. one thing that they really need is time to recover from the damage that was done by the Conservatives when they were in power. They're currently trying to set themselves out as being the common sense party, the party of the economy, but voters have long memories. They know the damage that was done to the economy under the Conservatives, but time is the one thing that Russell Finlay does not have.
He really doesn't. We'll wait and find out what happens next year. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us.